Okay, welcome everyone to today's second keynote lecture. This one by Sara Rachel Chant, Lund University.
Thank you very much. Thank you guys for having me. I'm super excited to be here. I am going to give a talk, I guess. I'm going to do a bunch of reading, unfortunately, not my style, but on the methodological approach to collective action theory. So I've been interested for a long time on the method of what is often called collective intentionality, what I call collective action theory, and I think I changed the name because I think collective intentionality is a symptom of the mistake in the method that is taken in collective action theory. So I want to help remedy the mistake. What's on the line here is that I think that the current approach to collective action theory involves what I call the wash, rinse, and repeat approach, so that you look at, so I'm very complicated, so try to follow me, okay? But what I think happens is that we look at our very best accounts, and I know I'm going to get some pushback on this too, but our very best accounts of individual action theory, and we just wash, rinse, and repeat. That means that if what distinguishes actions from non-actional events, what my advisor used to call the first problem in action theory, is that what's distinguished is belief-desire pairs or intentions or some mental state, then we wash, rinse, and repeat at the collective level for collective intentions, collective beliefs, and collective desires. Since the first problem in collective action theory is just like the first problem in individual action theory, a great deal of time is spent thinking about collective mental states. I'm going to argue towards the end that taking that wash, rinse, and repeat approach involves a couple of problems that I think are pretty serious. One is that I think the metaphysics stands or falls together. So it tends to be the case that you guys think that there are collective actions and collective responsibility and collective freedom and collective intentions and so forth, or that's not really the case. They're not really collective actions and collective intentions and collective responsibility and so forth. They tend to stand or fall together. Yes, I'm making wide sweeping claims. It's not always the case. There's some different subtle views out there which kind of mix it up a little bit. But if you take a very standard sort of wash, rinse, and repeat approach, you will get that sort of stand or fall together approach. More importantly, I'm really concerned with trying to work towards a unified account of collective action. One that bridges everything from Bratman's kind of stuff at one end of moving tables together and so forth, all the way to the other end of very highly structured corporate action. So my dream is to be able to have a theory that sort of bridges the wide range of cases. And so that's what I'm trying to begin to do, and I think that the first sort of order of business is to think about the methodological approach, because I think the method sets the stage for what we can and can't do. Unfortunately, I'm going to do a bit of reading, but hopefully I read with a little vigor. So I'm going to start, as I said in the beginning, the study of collective action and agency is governed by a methodological assumption that has been adopted in the philosophical literature with virtually no critical examination. Wash, rinse, and repeat enjoys a huge degree of plausibility. It appears never to have been explicitly argued for at all. Its plausibility probably derives from the observation that if one were to propose a theory of collective intention, according to which, for example, collective intentions bore no substantive resemblance to individual intentions, it wouldn't be clear why this was to count as a theory of collective intention. Employing wash, rinse, and repeat as a method for analyzing group-level concepts, such as collective intention, is to imply a kind of isomorphism. The isomorphism is between a respective set of individual and group-level concepts, as I was saying before, individual agents and collective agents, individual intentions and collective intentions, and the like. Taking wash, rinse, and repeat is tantamount to assuming that if there is an explanatory relationship between two individual level concepts, there should be a corresponding pair of collective level concepts bearing the same explanatory relationship to each other. Of course, we're all familiar with the famous 1960s example, Anscombe-Davidson action theory, in which we distinguish individual actions from non-actional events based on mental states like beliefs and belief pairs, desire pairs, and intentions. In Davidson's sinking of the Tirpitz example, when the submarine commander causes the Tirpitz to sink, we attribute an action to the commander because there was something he did intentionally. Suppose that the submarine commander intentionally pushed a button which launched the torpedo and thereby caused the Tirpitz to sink. The fact that the commander intentionally pushed the button, which thereby brings about the sinking of the Tirpitz, is why we say that bringing about the sinking of the Tirpitz, or more colloquially, sinking the Tirpitz, designates an action. Generalizing this example leads uncontroversially to the following. In all cases of action, and I have in parentheses individual action, something is done individually, intentionally. If we follow wash, rinse, and repeat in our theory of collective action, we're led to the following. In all cases of collective action, something is done collectively, intentionally. The near universal adoption of wash, rinse, and repeat explains why collective intention occupies such a central role in the literature on collective action. After all, individual intentions and intentional action are the most important concepts in virtually every analysis of individual action, and for those who employ wash, rinse, and repeat for analyzing collective action, it's practically inevitable that collective intentions and collective action should occupy an equally important place in their analyses. Individual actions depend on intentions and other mental states, but those states are only realized in agents. Thus, individual action and agency are also closely linked. In fact, Al-Mealy takes the concept of an agent to be so closely linked to action for individuals that a theory of agency is an immediate corollary of a theory of action. Call this the standard view of agency, SVA, according to which an agent is nothing more or less than something that acts. This is a highly plausible view of agency, at least within the domain of individual action and agency. The very idea of a non-agent capable of action, or an agent who is constitutionally incapable of performing any action at all, strikes us not only as implausible, but logically contradictory. Wash, rinse, and repeat, when applied to the simple view of agency, implies a collectivized version of SVA, SVA-C. A collective agent is nothing more or less than a collective that acts. If we accept the collective version, then questions concerning the nature of collective agents are settled almost immediately by a theory of collective action. The necessary and sufficient conditions for a group's acting collectively will tell us what it is for a group to be a collective agent, just as a theory of individual action tells us what it is for an individual to be an agent at all. Unfortunately, the simple view of agency collective faces serious concern owing to the fact that mental states are crucial for understanding individual action and agency. Since mental states are housed in individuals with minds, a straightforward application of wash, rinse, and repeat entails the existence of collective agents with minds of their own. Since any requirement could reasonably be taken as, a reductio of the view, I'm not saying anything ambitious, wash, rinse, and repeat and its first principle, SVA-C, are under serious doubt. Now, the straightest path through this difficulty is to argue that groups can have minds, and such an argument, in order to have any plausibility at all, must employ a highly attenuated sense of mind. The best example of this approach is Christian List and Philip Pettit's work on the discursive dilemma, in which they argue that groups can be institutional persons with minds of their own. This, what I take to be counterintuitive conclusion, is supported by the fact that groups can form judgments that are starkly at odds with the judgments of their members. However, the sense of mind that they use is so different from the mind of an individual that it's not clear that a group mind ought to count as a mind at all. Pettit acknowledges this, and I'm going to skip that quote. So even on their theory, group minds lack perception, memory, sentience, belief, and desire, which are so far removed from the concept of mind that the isomorphism required by wash, rinse, and repeat and the simple view of agency collective is severely diminished. Thus, there remains a tension between two desiderata regarding analyses of group-level concepts, especially difficult. One is wash, rinse, and repeat, and the simple view of agency collective require this isomorphism, and also analyses of these concepts must be extremely different because groups do not have minds or mental states in an ordinary sense. In short, whoever accepts wash, rinse, and repeat in SVAC must provide an account of how these seemingly mental states can be attributed to groups that lack minds. Because wash, rinse, and repeat and the simple view collective require attributing mental states, or some group-level correlate of mental states, to groups that do not have minds, advocates of these principles are in a bind. They have to look elsewhere for the mental states required by their methodology. The obvious response to this problem is to look to the individual members of a group and straightforwardly attribute mental states to those individuals. On this approach, groups have collective intentions largely in virtue of their members having individual intentions that bear certain relationships to each other. Proponents of this explanatory strategy also add other conditions, usually some kind of common knowledge conditions, and vary somewhat among their different accounts. Paradigmatic examples, we know the list: Michael Bratman, Raimo Tuomela, Margaret Gilbert, and of course we could go on and on here today. I'm going to skip, actually, because we all know Bratman's view, so I don't think we need to go through this. But Bratman's view is an excellent representative of this general approach. According to him, a shared intention, as you know, is an interlocking set of individual intentions that must meet two conditions with respect to the content of their relationships with each other. The first condition is that it's not the case that you and I merely have intentions to do some individual actions that just happen to bring about our Jane. For example, if we're to have a shared intention to lift a heavy table together, it's not good enough for the content of my intention to be, I shall lift my one end of the table. My intention is not merely to do something that's my part of lifting the table. Instead, I intend that we lift the table, and the content of my intention crucially refers to what we shall accomplish jointly. In addition, Bratman's account is typical in endorsing what I shall call the interactive knowledge condition. It states that our individual intentions are public in the sense that each of us knows that the other has the corresponding intention. For Bratman, this condition is iterated, in fact, infinitely, so that, for example, I know that you have the intention, you know that I have the intention, and so on. There are disagreements about the exact way to satisfy the interactive knowledge condition, but this condition is required by all theories that identify collective intentions with a structured set of individual intentions. Bratman's account is certainly not the only one to follow this general pattern. Raimo Tuomela analyzes joint intentions in terms of the individual possessing the right kind of we intention, where we intentions are related to each other in a specific way. I'm not going to read all of Raimo's stuff here, but he has a third requirement which represents that interactive knowledge requirement. Requirement 3 is Tuomela's version of the interactive knowledge condition. Individuals must have the right mutual beliefs because the beliefs of the other members about the beliefs of the other members of the group. It's important to point out that Tuomela's notion of mutual belief is what he calls a loop belief, not what mutual belief means in the technical literature and interactive epistemology. Individuals have a loop belief that P if everyone believes P and everyone believes that everyone believes P, and so on. In other words, this is just what is standardly known as common knowledge. Finally, Tuomela agrees with Bratman when he asserts that it's not enough for the individuals to have an intention to perform the actions that could make up a collective action. Rather, they have to possess an intention to do their part as their part of the collective action. Now, theories of collective action relying on group-level correlates of mental states invariably restrict the range of collective action to a very small subset, including moving a table together, going to New York together. So this is the other end of the spectrum that I was talking about. Awarding someone tenure, building a boat together, and so on. And the reason the analyses are restricted in this way, stems from the fact that groups vary considerably. There may be highly organized or totally disorganized. They may involve 2 agents. They may involve 2 million agents. If the interactive knowledge condition is what ties together agents in lieu of positing group minds, then if that condition were to have purchase in a general theory of collective action, it would have to be flexible enough to accommodate various kinds of groups. To see the significance of the interactive knowledge condition, let's consider a case in which a group does not have any beliefs about the other agents in the group. In other words, let's consider a case that fails to meet the interactive knowledge condition. For example, imagine a case, call it mob, in which a random mob of protesters suddenly turn violent and destroy a city block. Nearly all theories of collective action would judge that no collective action has been performed. The argument against such cases, counting as collective action, falls out of wash, rinse, and repeat, and the simple view of collective agency straight away. 1. Collective action requires collective agency. 2. Collective agency requires collective intention. 3. Collective intentions require interactive knowledge. 4. Interactive knowledge requires communication and/or a decision procedure. But disorganized groups have little or no communication and no decision procedure. Therefore, 6. No collective action is performed by disorganized groups. The striking feature of this argument is not the conclusion, but the fact that the first 3 premises are highly stipulative. They are not conclusions of any argument. Instead, they are plausible consequences of considering a very restricted range of clear cases of collective action that all happen to display a high degree of deliberate coordination and intentionality. Their support relies on wash, rinse, and repeat, and the simple view of agency collective, which are never argued for. Owing to the spontaneous and informal nature of the group in the mob case, standard accounts of collective action will not count it as a collective action. This is curious and in stark contrast to the much wider scope of individual action theory, which attempts to distinguish actions, including the most spontaneous actions of individuals, from non-actional events, and this is so even if the bigger action is an unintended consequence of actions performed by an individual. So if mob behavior and other cases of spontaneous group behavior ought not count as collective, then the theory owes us an argument to that effect and not merely a set of stipulations. The same claim is made and the same observation holds for cases that are not at all spontaneous. Consider the following example: bomb factory. A factory has been cleverly designed by an evil mastermind who wants to produce bombs. The assembly line requires several workers who have been deceived into believing that they're each constructing harmless widgets. However, the steps that each worker performs are in fact combined in a clever and subtle way, such that it's bombs and not widgets which roll off the conveyor belt at the end of the assembly line. It's an extremely plausible claim to say that the workers unintentionally built bombs together, and that this is a collective action. After all, their work is highly coordinated, interdependent, requires communication, and so on, but by stipulation, there is no shared intention on the part of any of them to build bombs. hence no collective intention to do so, and therefore no collective action to build bombs together. A theory of collective action and intention may reject bomb factory as an example of collective action, but again, this rejection ought to be the conclusion of an argument and not by definition. In short, many existing theories of collective action and intention are far too stipulative. They reject a wide range of plausible cases of collective action too quickly and without providing an argument for doing so. You guys didn't bring tomatoes, did you? Typically, wash, rinse, and repeat uses the most basic actions. Okay, so now we're at wash, rinse, and repeat what? Typically, wash, rinse, and repeat uses the most basic actions of individuals as its model for collective action, despite the fact that basic actions are the least similar to collective actions. The reason for focusing on basic actions is that these acts help explain the first problem in action theory. So when we ask the question, the first problem in action theory, what distinguishes actions from non-actional events, it's there that we're focusing on basic acts. But if we wash, rinse, and repeat everything from individual action theory, the first problem in collective action theory is just the question, what distinguishes collective actions from non-collective actional events, or how I like to put it, mere collections of actions? The answer, of course, takes us right back to intentions and other mental states. But luckily, there's other ways to employ the wash, rinse, and repeat strategy. Instead of using basic actions of individuals as a model of collective actions of groups, it's more instructive to think about complex individual actions that have actions as parts. For example, writing a paper, practicing a martial arts routine, taking the Great Danes for a walk, and earning a PhD each comprise more than one component action. Carl Janet's book on action calls such actions aggregate actions of individuals. Questions concerning aggregate action are importantly different from questions concerning basic action. The latter concerns the first problem in action theory, but aggregate actions concern the problem of what distinguishes aggregate actions from a mere collection of actions. This is what I've called elsewhere the second problem in action theory. Notice that the second problem in action theory does not consider whether the performance of aggregate action requires a further agent over and above the agent that performed the constituent acts. After all, those constituent acts bottom out in basic actions of individuals, and if the simple view of agency is correct, then we have all the agency we need. If we take aggregate action to be an appropriate model for collective action, then it's no longer obvious that a second collective agent must be posited over and above the individual agents who are part of the group, especially for the one end of the spectrum. I'm going to talk a little bit about the other end. Similarly, it should not be a foregone conclusion that a uniquely collective form of agency must be present if a collective action is performed, just as there is no uniquely aggregate form of agency when individuals perform aggregate actions. Okay. Next section. So far it seems that the problem with analyses of collective action and agency is not with the wash, rinse, and repeat methodology itself, but rather with which form of individual action is being used to wash, rinse, and repeat. If theories of basic action are used as a model for theories of collective action, then the following methodological assumptions are virtually inevitable. Wash, rinse, and repeat, and the simple view of agency collective are powerful constraints on any account of collective action and agency. They jointly imply that collective agency is a precondition of collective action. Collective agency is inextricably linked with the ability to form collective intentions. Thus, we're led naturally to the view that collective action requires collective intention. And therefore, an account of collective intention and agency is taken to be a central component of any satisfactory account of collective action, and furthermore, alleged cases of collective action that don't involve collective agency, alleged cases of collective responsibility that don't involve collective agency, and the like are ruled out by stipulation. But if aggregate action is used as a model of collective action, these assumptions are cleared away. The problem is not what distinguishes collective actions from non-actional events. The question is what distinguishes collective actions from a mere collection of actions. And notice that focusing on that second problem in collective action theory is not a post hoc suggestion to sidestep a difficult problem. After all, aggregate actions and collective actions are actions that have parts in a way that basic action and collective action share no non-stipulative similarity. An important benefit of avoiding these assumptions is that a much broader range of collective action can be accommodated. Indeed, it's easy to come up with examples of circumstances that are plausible enough cases of collective action which fail under the traditional accounts to count as collective actions. Such cases may fail to satisfy the requirements of traditional theories for a variety of different reasons. For example, Lost in Paris. Two friends decide on the spur of the moment to go to Paris. They have no specific plans about where they'll stay or what they'll do when they are in Paris. Now, you may think that's implausible, but if you travel with me, that's how we travel. The friends soon become separated in a crowd, of course, and they're unable to find each other. Each, however, decides that their best bet is to go to the nearest landmark, which happens to be the Eiffel Tower, and they're soon reunited. And consider the following variant of bomb factory, spy-proof factory. Concerned that industrial spies might infiltrate Widget Co.'s factory and steal information about the widget assembly process, the assembly line is designed to keep their workers as ignorant as possible. Each knows that only the bare minimum necessary to do their part of assembling the widgets. None even know that they're building widgets. Workers never seen each other or permitted to communicate. They don't even have an approximate idea of how many workers there are. The workers know nothing except for the simple task they must each perform of their specific station. In each of the cases I've given so far, the individuals engage in highly coordinated behavior that intuitively ought to count as collective action. In Mob, the mob destroys a city block despite having no decision procedure. The workers in Bomb Factory build bombs despite not intending that their actions should be part of a bomb building process. In Lost in Paris, the friends are deliberately reunite, even though they had no plan for how to do so. And the workers build widgets in Spy-Proof Factory despite not knowing anything about the workers or their overall task. In each of these cases, the agents fail to meet the interactive knowledge condition, but arguably perform a collective action. Now, there are a range of cases of collective action, and that range is defined by how deliberate coordination there is on the part of the individuals who perform the collective action. On one end of the spectrum, we have highly deliberate and carefully coordinated actions of collectives. These are cases that writers on collective action and agency have typically focused. They involve participants sharing a common goal, as I've said, devising a plan to achieve that goal by way of a decision procedure involving communication and deliberation. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have spontaneous, less well-structured collective actions. These need not have any group decision procedure. The angry mob is an extreme case. The people in the mob act collectively, spontaneously, without deliberately or having a decision procedure for the group. Merely observing the mood and behavior of the other people is enough to initiate mob behavior. The tourists lost in Paris and the widget assembly workers occupy some places somewhere between these two extremes. What all of the cases share is that individuals have their own intentions, which somehow bring about coordinated and purposeful behavior on the part of the group. The question that must be answered by a theory of collective action is how that coordination is brought about. One way is having a highly structured group apply a decision procedure to determine what they collectively and individually do. This is an important class of cases. It also happens to be the class of cases in which it's most plausible to attribute collective agency. But it represents only one kind of collective action. Indeed, it's an extreme kind of case on the far end of a much broader spectrum. An analogy to aggregate action is helpful once again. One way that a person can perform an aggregate action is by carefully and deliberately thinking about the steps necessary in order to complete a complex task. For example, building a rocket ship designates such an aggregate action. It requires a great deal of planning. A large number of separate actions must be performed in the right way in order for someone to complete it. Other aggregate actions are much more spontaneous and don't require such deliberation. They may be habitual, spontaneous. They may even have component actions that are totally accidental. This is in direct conflict with Genet, by the way. Aggregate actions vary along the same spectrum as do collective actions, and it would be a mistake to take only the most deliberate cases of aggregate action as genuine examples and ignore the rest. And what I'm suggesting is that similarly, we should not make the same mistake regarding collective action. So, when collective agency is understood to be a non-essential feature of collective action, we can no longer rely exclusively on certain group-level properties when constructing a theory of collective action. We certainly cannot assume that there's a decision procedure for the group as a whole. And it would be implausible to require a group's eye view of the situation. One cannot, as Natalie Gold and Robert Sugden suggest, simply stipulate that the individuals use team reasoning to make their decisions from the perspective of the group when deciding what they ought to do. The theory must be thoroughly individualistic if it is to encompass the wide range of cases that we actually see. It must explain how the individuals in the group are motivated to do their part of what will be the collective action. In other words, a theory of collective action must be essentially contrastive in the following sense. Collective actions take place in the context of a specific kind of choice faced by each member of the group. In a simplified form, this choice is between two actions, the collective and individual. Each action has a potential payoff that's contingent on the actions of the other members of the group. The action C is cooperative, that is, its payoff is contingent on the other members performing C. If they do not, then the payoff of C is lower. The individualistic action I, on the other hand, has a payoff that's not contingent on the behavior of others. We can illustrate this with the case of two friends who are separated from each other in Paris. Let us say that each knows that he is capable of having a pretty good time in Paris without his friend. Walking around Paris as a lone tourist is I, in this example, because it has a payoff that does not depend on what the other friend is doing. But each will have a much more enjoyable time if they're reunited, hence going to the Eiffel Tower to look for one's friend is C. It potentially has a higher payoff than I, but the payoff will only be realized if the other person also chooses C. Each of them will have to decide between I and C, weighing the potential payoffs and risks. The risk is understood to be whatever payoff is lost by choosing C when the other members of the group choose I. More precisely, it's the difference between I's payoff, which does not depend on anyone else's behavior, and C's payoff given that the other person does not perform C. So in this example, it's really quite simple. It's natural for each friend to try and go to the Eiffel Tower to find the other person because the risk is very low if they miscoordinate. It's just a loss of a little bit of time, which happens to be in a very pleasant location. This is why it's just the loss of a little, this is why it's very plausible to suppose that the two friends will be united. They will likely be able to act collectively because each person's part of the collective action carries a very low risk and a substantial potential payoff. A collective action occurs when enough members of a group choose C over I. A theory of collective action must explain why this choice will or will not be made. Obviously, explanations of why a specific group cooperated or failed to cooperate in any given situation will vary in important ways, and this is consistent with what we recognize about the range of collective actions. Now, clearly, a variety of different mechanisms may cause the members of the group to select C over I, thereby bringing about the collective action. Formal decision procedures of the kind that indicate agency is one kind of mechanism. But other mechanisms may be much more informal, and in some cases the payoff C is so high compared to I, and the risk is so low that the collective action is brought about essentially for free, as it were, without any identifiable coordination mechanism except for the rationality of the individuals. This observation allows us to subsume traditional accounts of collective action and agency under a more general theory in the following way. Consider the class of high-risk collective actions, cases where the performance of C without the others also performing C would come at an extreme penalty. Ensuring coordination on a high-risk collective action will frequently rely on having a formalized group structure and decision procedure in which in order to guarantee that the requisite information and incentives are common knowledge within the group. So I'm thinking of something just short of like the coordinated attack problem. So unless the generals can coordinate the attack and one shows up without the other, there'll be certain demolition of the general and his troops. Therefore, high-risk actions are the ones that are most likely to satisfy traditional accounts of collective action and intention. But we would also expect groups that regularly face such circumstances to be the ones that are most likely to count as collective agents as well. In this way, a more inclusive theory of collective action can accept these specific cases. Furthermore, such a theory can explain why the group displays the hallmarks of agency. If we keep to wash, rinse, and repeat, then we'll be led to the view that collective intentions may be present in a much wider range of collective actions, even if there is no collective agency. And this turns out to be a natural position to hold. It's plausible, for instance, to say that two friends have a collective intention to reunite in Paris. And if we continue to attribute collective intentions to groups that perform collective actions, then we have to make room for a weaker form of collective intention that encompasses examples such as the angry mob and factory workers in the spy-proof widget factory. We can embrace a wide range of collective intentions and actions without committing ourselves to implausible accounts of collective agents. This is one of the lessons we learn when we take aggregate action as an appropriate model of collective action. Recall that in aggregate actions, we feel no need to posit an additional agent above and beyond the individual who performs a component actions, and the same may be true for a wider range of collective action and also for weaker forms of collective intention. There is no contradiction, for example, in saying that there can be a collective intention without a collective agent. All the agency required for the collective intention is possessed by the individuals in the group. So I am seriously under time, but I don't think that you guys will be too upset with that. Thank you guys very much.
Thanks, Sarah. I was hoping maybe you could say a bit more about umbrella of the idea is that you want a position where you can have unintentional collective acts, at least provide for that possibility. And so do we have to then say that there can be such things as unintentional aggregate acts? And are there any complications with that?
Okay, that's a cool and interesting question. I haven't thought about it. You know, the way, obviously, you heard the structure of the argument and the way, I'm just sort of beginning a view, so I don't have a full-fledged view toward a theory. And of course, as you understood from the paper, I'm trying to show that what we've been traditionally doing is looking at basic acts and then offering that maybe a better analogy for washrooms repeat is aggregate actions. So I do have a theory, and I do have a paper actually called Unintentional Collective Actions, where I distinguish between two types of unintentional collective actions. One that I call weakly unintentional, and one that I call strongly unintentional. So as you can see from the paper, I used to think that washrooms repeat was just stupid, like we shouldn't be doing that. But I actually have become, have a more nuanced view now. And the nuanced view is, no, it's completely reasonable to proceed. It's just that we have to be asking a serious question about what it is we're repeating or modeling. For a moment, when you look at individual action, we start with the basic action, and there's only one form of unintentional basic action, right? That's when you've got an action that's intentional under some description. So if I perform some basic mental act or some basic bodily movement, so long as it's an action, even if it produces a causal consequence that wasn't intended or part of the content of the intention, bringing about that causal consequence is something that takes out something I've done unintentionally. Now, when you go to Genet, Genet is the only person, I don't know if anybody here knows of anybody else who talks about aggregate action in any detail. Do you? No? Okay. No help here. All right. But Genet is the only person that I know of who works on aggregate action, and he doesn't talk about unintentional aggregate action at all. But the way that, in fact, he's got a very restrictive theory of aggregate action. It's one where each action, in order for it to be an aggregate action, it must be an intentional aggregate action under some description. And in order for it to be intentional, every component must be an action, and hence intentional under some description. Okay. Of course, he doesn't talk like Davidson. So the way that I've thought about modeling the theory, since I subscribe to a more Davidsonian account, is that once you have that intentional aggregate action, then you can imagine situations in which, by whatever, taking my Great Danes for a walk intentionally, I thereby, destroy the grass that I've walked over, and that's something that we do unintentionally by taking our walk. That's the sort of closest form for basic action. But in aggregate action, I think that there can be cases, just like I think obviously there can be cases, so this really gets to your point, that there can be cases in which there's not just that kind of individual unintentional aggregate action, though that I haven't talked about before. My feeling is that, especially if I'm going to hold that view about collective action, then I've got to take it back to individual action, as you're suggesting, individual aggregate action, as you're suggesting, and think that there's going to be at least some cases in which my performing a bunch of individual actions that bring about, and it's actually in a paper that I call the special composition question in action, bring about some non-additive consequence, can be used to generate a description that picks out something I've done unintentionally. So suppose that I have no intention, as Genet requires of me to have an intention over each constituent action that they will or might be a part of my overall aggregate action, but I just do a bunch of things and bring about, say, the destruction of the ozone layer, whatever it is that you want, then it may very well be the case. In fact, I'll judge in in at least my case, that I've done something, albeit unintentionally, a single thing.
Okay, so one worry I have here is that there's kind of another unargued assumption
Yes.
today,
Yeah.
namely that there are collective actions in a relatively robust sense. I mean, we use action verbs to describe acts of nature, behavior of machines, and so on. But when pressed on it, it's kind of like these aren't really actions, but it's kind of like a convenient way to talk about these things.
Right. Yeah.
And when it comes to collectives, I mean, we could say, well, there are just individual actions, and then there are these complex collections of them, and it becomes too complicated to track all the individual actions. So as a shorthand, we talk about collective actions.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then, are there collective actions to begin with? Then, I mean, one strategy is to start an individual action and sort of, okay, what is paradigmatic with the case with individual actions?
Yeah.
That they are intentional.
Yes.
So an easy way to kind of answer this question, are the collective actions, is to try to show that there's intentionality at play, even in this case, collective action. Of course, if you think that strategy is misplaced, I mean, I can think that might be a reasonable argument to make, but then the question is, how do you earn the right to call these actions to begin with?
Okay, so I think there's two questions in what you were just asking. One is why think that there are collective actions at all, right? And so the reason why I care about collective actions, the reason why I care about collective actions and thinking that there are such things as collective actions, and that there is an answer to what's the difference between your collections of actions and a collective or a single thing. I call it a composite action elsewhere, between aggregates and groups. It goes actually back to the old story before Davidson and Anscombe about why we cared about action in the first place, and it's deeply connected for me about moral responsibility. So I think that, because I think that the way to get moral responsibility, which I believe into, it tracked up, is by things that we do and not things that just happen. It's in fact why I think that even in cases where I don't have an intention that governs the collection of things that I do, if I do something that really screws up the world, I may be very much morally responsible for it, which pushes my view to think that I've probably done that thing. It didn't just happen to me. And why do I think that I've done that? Well, because I did in a series of intentional actions. Okay? So I brought about this consequence. So that's part one. That's why I think that there are collective actions.
But isn't that kind of like why you want to think that there are collective actions?
It's yes. Yes. And if you want to deny that there are collective actions, then I also would think you'd want to deny that there are individual actions we don't do anything at all. And then I'd be really interested in hearing from you about what you think, like, is there also no moral responsibility?
Yeah, but we have intentions in the individual case. So the question is, so this is assuming that
I felt like you pushed me this way and then you brought me back that way. So, but yes, no, and I do agree to collective intentions at the end, but a very different view than what's standardly appreciated here in this room. So the idea is, I mean, this is the beginnings of an idea, so you have to forgive me for not having a fully developed view. But my concern is that when you develop a theory of collective intention that is modeled in the wash, rinse, and repeat approach on basic action, you're looking at the wrong question. You're looking at a question about what distinguishes actions from non-actions. I think of it much more as a composition question, and I always have. I've always thought of it more along the lines of like a problem in material objects.
I mean, I guess what I'm trying to do is to describe maybe what we call the wash, rinse, and repeat strategy as kind of like a way to try to earn the right to talk about actions rather than events.
I am using wash, rinse, and repeat on a different kind of model. So I'm wash, rinsing, and repeating aggregate action, okay? And so it's in virtue of looking at aggregate action, it's in virtue of looking at aggregate action that I think we can sort of get the right thought going. Additionally, I'm very concerned with why we ever trade our individual interests for doing anything collectively. And my guess is that what explains sort of the Lost in Paris example to much more coordinated actions. So I'm trying to build a theory that goes from one end of the spectrum to the other. It's very grand, but I think what I believe is that is based on the crucial interactive knowledge condition in almost every theory of collective action. So where I'm going with it is I'm going to argue that you get a kind of flexibility in an account if you take that view alone. So why do we successfully coordinate getting back to the Eiffel Tower even though we can't talk or communicate or we have no decision procedure? We get in what I call an epistemic equilibrium state, where the penalty for miscoordination is basically nothing. It sucks, but the payoff is great. And so sometimes it's easier to coordinate. Sometimes when the penalty is so great, you need those decision procedures in place or there ain't no way. And so the idea is going to be that the unified sort of collective intention theory is one that is going to play, the equilibrium account is going to play a crucial role there in explaining why it is that things that aren't even agents at all can perform collective actions all the way to the most complex cases. So that's sort of the idea there. But my concern, which is why I'm sort of in some sense all over the place, is my concern is that while a lot of my friends here are focusing on kind of a subset of these cases, I'm trying to explain all the way from what you might not want to think are collective actions at all, and I'm trying to argue that the reason why is because they've taken a particular kind of approach, and that if you go my way, then you could start to maybe figure out how we can get a unity across these different kinds of cases. That's the idea.
So we have close to 10 people on the list, so I would ask to hold off on follow-ups if possible, and try to keep. Well, yeah, that's right. And keep questions very short. Okay, so Laura.
Yeah, thanks. So you've actually partly answered my question in response to the first one. So I was wondering how wide our reflective equilibrium should be when we are trying to define the conceptual boundaries of collective action, and whether considerations about moral responsibility would come in. So whether we want our account of collective action to partly be responsive to those sorts of things, it sounds like the answer is yes. But if the answer is yes, then my impression is that's part of what motivates a strong kind of collective intentionality account of collective action. So when you gave the example of the spy-proof factory, I don't remember the exact details of the example.
Yeah,
but
it's
the
okay.
idea is that each person on this assembly line performs a particular task, but they have no idea to what overall outcome they are contributing. And let's assume that the overall outcome is bad, like evil atomic bombs or something like that.
Sure.
And you said linguistically this looks like a collective action. I still want to be able to call it a collective action if I'm understood correctly.
Yeah, you're right.
And I thought, okay, so why would I not want to call it a collective action? Well, because my sense is, at least my moral intuition is, if each individual is not at all aware of he or she contributing together to this bad outcome, then I find that the attribution of responsibility to these various individuals for the outcome would be somewhat morally mistaken. I mean, they may be responsible for having done this particular thing, but somehow I don't think I can blame them for having contributed to it. So, taking more responsibility into account seems to me to push us towards a more kind of collective intention of this, I wouldn't know how to call it, way of regimenting the conceptual boundaries.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I do need to think about it more, but my temptation to say, at least off the cuff for a moment, is I think that's right, but I think that's true even in cases, very primitive cases of individual basic action. So of course it's not the case that every action that you perform, every basic action you perform is something for which you should be morally responsible for. It's not the case, or that you are held morally responsible for. It's not even the case that if I perform a basic action that has a causal consequence that's awful, like suppose I just don't know, I think I gave this example before, but I raise my hands and then that causes like a hurricane in Houston or whatever, even though it has that horrible consequence, that then my theory of action that says that it was an action is mistaken. And so, on the one hand, yes, it definitely is got to be the case that it's motivated by moral responsibility, and that's why we want a theory of action. But just because it's the case that it's not, and I agree with you in the spy-proof factory, assuming a couple of things like there's no reason why they should have done. Yeah, that's a good question.
Thanks, Sarah. So this is kind of in line with the last questions. So I wonder what, so I really like the sort of aggregate action model strategy. But what, here's just a suggestion, could we sort of interpret all the standard accounts of joint intention or shared intention and think of those as models on aggregate action.
Mm-hmm.
So you said at one point in the talk that there's no aggregate form of agency. But I'm not sure. I think there is an aggregate form of agency that matters for moral responsibility, where acting across time, and we have plans and beliefs and memories and so on. So I just wonder what you think about that way of
Yep.
sort of using your model question.
Yeah, so, okay, so I'm not quite sure how to answer this efficiently, but, so I don't, so let me give answer the second question first. I don't think that, we're currently using aggregate action, and I don't think we can quote say that we're using aggregate action, because if we were using aggregate action as the model, then we would be thinking of this as the second problem in action theory, and we are not. We are definitely thinking about it as the first problem and not the second. Now, if you guys are, does that make sense what I'm saying? So the way that I've always been thinking about it is just like individuals. On the one hand, the first problem in action theory is for philosophy of mind. And the other hand, the second problem in action theory is the individuation question, and what I call metaphysics. So there's a mind question, there's a metaphysics question. And I believe that the majority of folks in collective intentionality are thinking of it as a mind question. And so what I'm saying is that when, and that makes complete sense if you're using basic action as the model. But if you move it from, but the argument is, but look, collective action isn't really like that. It's more like an individuation question. And when you move to that second problem, then you aren't so focused. It's not that I'm denying collective intentions, but that might be what you layer into an intentional view of collective action, or something like that. You might say that there are some cases of, like, when highly structured, coordinated problems that require decision procedure and so forth, that there is a relevant collective intention, although you guys aren't going to find it very intentional on my part, It'll be that equilibrium state, but we need to get these other pieces too, and that's all the way at the end of the spectrum, where we aren't in that sort of decision procedure and so forth. And all of these, I can say for sure, like, on that end of the spectrum, the critical part of my work has always been on that end of the spectrum. And I'm not even talking about what you guys are talking about. And that's true. That's true. So sorry, the first bit is, it was a beautiful question. The first bit was, that, there really is an agent that's over and above in some sense, and the individual constituent agents and so on. I mean, we have to talk about personal identity and agency and all that kind of stuff over time or whatever. But I'm imagining, just suppose that I have some like memory continuity theory of agency or whatever. I'm just also imagining that on one end of the spectrum, suppose I forget like every second. So I talk to you, then I forget what happened, I talk to you, and so on. That I have talked to, I have done something, namely given my talk. Like maybe I can't remember each sentence in my talk, but I performed each sentence of the talk and I performed the talk. So you might think, well, that doesn't count as like an intentional lecture or something like that, because maybe I need something about personal identity or agency over that thing, but it does count as giving a lecture. That's the view.
Yeah, so I very much agree with your point that there's a whole spectrum of different kinds of collective action, and that it is important to distinguish between them. And I also agree that many phenomena that we describe as collective action do not involve a group agent. I mean, if you think about a demonstration or collective action as in solving the collective action problem, all of these phenomena do not involve a group agent. Likewise, carrying a piano downstairs together in the sort of Bratman examples, those that don't involve a group agent. I mean, I would nonetheless want to suggest that there is a subclass of cases of collective action where the wash, rinse, and repeat strategy of the very conventional sort is fruitful, namely the idea that we can attribute those actions to a group agent with a mind of its own. So, and that's the class of cases of actions that we attribute, for instance, to a firm or a corporation or a highly structured, organized, institutionalized collective. And I took it that your objection to the idea of group agency with a group mind here was that the notion of mindedness doesn't sufficiently resemble individual mindedness. That I think was the concern that you expressed. But I mean, I would want to say here that provided we adopt an appropriate functionalist theory of the mind, then at least in principle, a corporation can have a mind in a very similar way in which an individual does, and also in which, for instance, a robot does. So in the functionalist sense,
or even forgetful Sarah does giving a lecture.
So the firm or corporation could have beliefs and desires in the functionalist sense. A corporation can have memory in the functionalist sense. A corporation could even go asleep in the functionalist sense and wake up again. It could even potentially have emotions in the functionalist sense. If we try to figure out what is the functional role that emotion plays in relation to action. Of course, whether it really does that, or whether such a corporate agent resembles more a kind of psychopath, that is very much a contingent question that will depend on the details of the organizational structure. But at least conceptually, I think there is plenty of room still for this subclass of cases of the conventional wash.
No, I think that's right, but I think so. I agree with you, and I'm actually the more I've been thinking about your work, have been inspired to think that. But I think it's an overlay on my basic structure, which gets the second problem right first. So I think that's true for individuals as well. Like it's not in virtue of having necessarily a collective agent or a decision procedure or what have you that makes a collection of actions a single thing. But there are cases like that, and the cases that you work on are exactly like that. So I'm comfortable with that sort of functionalist talk, and that's why towards the end, maybe I didn't, I mean it was a red paper or whatever, but towards the end I say that exactly, precisely. Yeah. So I think that's exactly right. What I want, though, is that if you require that, then if you require that for all collective actions, then you cannot get all of these cases. And that's why when I talk to Bratman and I try to offer a counterexample, he says it's not, because that he doesn't do that kind of action. But the hope is that I can provide a unified theory across his and these complex cases. But I think you're exactly right.
So this might be kind of similar to Others' question, I'm not entirely sure. So it's a question about how we individuate aggregate actions. So you gave the example of kind of writing a paper, taking the Great Danes for a walk, etc. So these are actions where there is a purpose that unifies the collection of basic actions that make up the aggregate action. Even in the forgetful Sara case, even though you kind of forget who you're talking to at different times, you don't really conceptualize the lecture as one thing that you're doing. It's true at each of those points that what you're trying to do is communicate some ideas to us or something. But then in the
an idea.
Right.
An idea.
Yeah. Okay. Don't want to be too ambitious.
No.
Whereas in the bomb factory case,
Yes.
each of these people is there for a different reason. They could all be, most of them are there to get a pay packet, some of them are there because they love widgets,
Yes.
whatever. So there isn't that same unifying purpose. And so is that a disanalogy between
The way you
aggregate
tell it
actions
is a
and- right,
disanalogy.
So then
But I want to
disanalogy-
no. You just gave me a different case, and so I want to go back to where it is an analogy, right?
Okay.
Yeah, if what you're describing is a situation in which each individual in the bomb factory, whatever case, has a different purpose, then right. I'm trying
So the
to think.
question is, could that be a collective action? If they're all there for different purpose? That's really what's underlying my question.
I think it will turn out to be a collective action in many cases. I mean, you have to fill in the details of the case, and that's one of the things that I've been sort of mentioning down there about. And for me, it's going to depend on things in that particular scenario with very strongly unintentional collective action, what the consequences are jointly. Does that make sense? So here's a view, and this goes back to a really old paper of mine. But in my paper on, I call the special composition in question and action, I argue that just like in the case of individuals, that you can pick out actions in virtue of, say, their causal consequences, that you can use that causal consequence to pick out something you've done. And so take any causal consequence of any action you performed, you can generate a description that picks out what you did. And so in cases of aggregate action, even if I like move this thing and do this thing and whatever, like this or whatever, and that produces a non-additive consequence, that non-additive consequence picks out that. And that's the idea.
So the set of actions that I've thought throughout my entire life is an aggregate action.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean that's
But I know that sounds really disgusting and you want to vomit right now. It's okay. Here's why you want to vomit, but I don't. You're really an action theorist, a moral theorist, and so forth. But I'm really a metaphysician, and in metaphysics, that there's only one object. It's just not a problem, and I consider this a metaphysical question.
Right, so you tend, if I understand you correctly, you try to do this marketalism repeat approach, and you focus on the what you call the second prong of action theory.
Yes.
So then basically my question is, what are basic collective actions? Because as I see the individuation problem for individual agency is that, well, and I think you hinted at this, that the answer to that question relies on basic actions.
Sorry, say that last part again. What you think is what?
You seem to say that the answer to the individuation problem for individual action relies on the notion of basic actions
Yes.
for individuals.
Yes.
So if you want to answer the same questions for collective agency, then I'm just wondering, what do you think is a basic collective action?
not going to answer that question. I mean, in the sense of, well, I'll give you, like...
Because there are many, some people construct it in a mentalistic way. They say it's something that the person does not do by doing something else, which sounds like it relies on mental attitude.
It does.
And that's
Basic actions always require mental states.
So they do require mental states.
Individual basic actions require mental states. It's the first problem in action theory. So you have some event, and whether that event is an action depends. Simple model depends on whether it's causally related to intention the right way. Okay, so suppose you have this counts as an action. That's, is it a mere non-action event, or is it an action? Depends on mental states, say. That's what I think. And then that's true for all of these little actions. And then, of course, actions always have, like, causal consequences. And the causal consequences can always be used to pick out something you've done, right? And so the way that I'm attributing much of collective intentionality is proceeding is saying about this question, is this a collective action or a mere event? Almost to that point, right? And what I'm saying is that that's the wrong question. The question is it a single thing? I don't even care about the word collective action. Is it a single thing, or is it many actions? Is it a single action or many actions? Now, suppose that these things are all performed by one person. That question is a question about, I'm arguing that question is a question about action individuation. Okay, and not a question that requires an intention to be built onto this. That under certain circumstances, just like you can produce a consequence and bringing about that consequence picks out this, under some circumstances, bringing about a consequence that depends on two actions can be used to pick out this. In most cases, in my special composition question paper, I argue that the most interesting salient questions are questions that are brought about intentionally, but not all. And so I argue that there's various ways you can have non-additive causal generation, what I call non-additive conventional generation from Goldman, and so forth, that can be used to pick out these actions. In cases in which there's no intention that governs the collection of actions, I argue that that consequence picks out those actions as a unit, albeit unintentionally. So it's just two ways of going. So there is, in some sense, there isn't the basic action, it's an action individuation question. We have all the basic actions we need. That's what I'm arguing. We've got these bits. We don't need to have now a basic aggregate action and a basic collective action. I'm not saying that view is silly. In fact, it's going to be, if people wrote more about aggregate action, they would say that. That's what Janae says. But Janae also says the very silly thing, which is that every constituent action must be intentional, and so on and so forth. So if I type the word supercalifragilisticexpialidocious and I accidentally hit one of the letters that happens to be right, it's not an intentional aggregate action. So.
On that note.
Okay.
Thank you very much.